Okay, hello everybody and welcome to the ESDR kitchen. For those of you who are not too familiar with our kitchen, it refers to a series of live events that the ESDR has been organizing for the past months to try and maintain some kind of scientific communication during those quite challenging times for all of us. So we have within the kitchen 4 series of events: the recipe book where new techniques are being presented, the freshly book, the Freshly Baked series where recent and groundbreaking discoveries are discussed, molecular cuisine where leaders in their field share their personal journey through the scientific discovery, and finally the sweet and sour series where 2 protagonists discussed a controversial issue. And today it is my great pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers, 2 world-renowned experts on atopic dermatitis, Sinead Langan and Sara, who will discuss the pros and cons of an association between cardiovascular diseases and atopic eczema. So Professor Sinead Langan is a Wellcome Senior Clinical Fellow and Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She also works as an honorary consultant dermatologist in St. John. She trained in medicine at the Queen's University in Belfast, completed her PhD at the University of Nottingham, and gained postdoctoral experience at the University of Pennsylvania, USA. She has led a large number of programs focusing on understanding gene-environment interactions in eczema and other conditions, trying to harness the power of electronic medical records and administrative data to provide answers for important questions related to a range of skin diseases. Professor Sara is a clinical academic dermatologist. Sara trained at the University of Edinburgh, and she specialized in dermatology in Newcastle, moved to Dublin for a fellowship in pediatric dermatology, then moved to work with Irvin McLean in Dundee on atopic dermatitis, and finally established an independent lab at Dundee in 2013. Her research focuses on increasing the understanding of how a person's genetic makeup predisposes to atopic eczema and associated systemic condition. So I just need to mention that this episode is supported by Amgen and Sanofi. Please submit all your questions to the chat or the Q&A function. Sinead and Sara, thank you for your willingness to contribute another meal to the kitchen. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the introduction, Ellie, very generous, and thank you to the ESDR for inviting us to speak. So this is the title that we were given, and here's an overview of what we're aiming to study, to cover in the next 20 minutes. So just to be clear, this is a hot topic and we are going to debate, but we don't really have opposing views. We disappointingly agree. Really what we're giving is different perspectives of addressing a challenging question. So the question is, how do cardiovascular risk factors associate with eczema or AD? Is this important, and what can we learn about it? So Sinead's going to give us the epidemiological evidence of associations, and I'm going to give what is currently known or what can be elucidated from genetic insights into a small portion of this question. And the importance of future work is a big part of our message today. In terms of conflict of interest, Sinead and I are both part of the Horizon 2020 IMI project Biomap. And just to state as well, Amgen and Sanofi are funding this kitchen, but we personally haven't received any funding from them, and they haven't influenced our talks at all. So I'll now hand over to Sinead.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk at the ESDR Kitchen. It's truly an honour to be invited. And I'm delighted to talk about this question: is there an association between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular risk? Atopic dermatitis, many of the clinicians amongst us know, is extremely important. And it's important because it's common. It affects 20% of children and up to 10% of adults. But it's also important to understand that it's clinically often very heterogeneous. So it varies from being a transient mild condition, such as the pattern we can see on the left-hand side in the young child, right through to being chronic, severe, persistent, lifelong disease. So extremely variable. So why is it important to understand if there's an association between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular diseases? So cardiovascular diseases remain a very substantial source of morbidity and mortality globally. So if there is an association between a common condition like atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular disease, it's very important for us as clinicians and researchers to know about it and to research it. So why might atopic dermatitis be associated with cardiovascular diseases? Now, what I'm showing you here is half of a directed acyclic graph. So that's one of the steps I would take if I was working out how I was going to answer this question. So we start off with considering what's our exposure is atopic dermatitis. Our outcome, cardiovascular diseases. But of course, this is complex, isn't it? Because there are many factors which we call confounders, which can mix up the association between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular diseases. And what we as epidemiologists are trying to do is to see if there's a true rather than a spurious association between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular diseases. And of course, it's even more complex than what I've shown you in that slide. This is the other half of the directed acyclic graph. What we can see in the blobs in blue are mediators. So mediators are factors that are on the causal pathway between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular outcomes. So here we know that atopic dermatitis is associated with depression and anxiety. And we also know that there's an increased risk of cardiovascular diseases associated with depression and anxiety. So potentially that could be acting as a mediator of the association. And when we're analyzing this association, it's very important to adjust for confounders. And we might adjust for mediators if we're trying to answer the question, how much is atopic dermatitis associated with cardiovascular outcomes independent of known risk factors for cardiovascular diseases? And this graph could be even more complex. This is a simplified version of this scenario. And one other aspect that wasn't covered in the directed acyclic graph is sleep. So anybody who looks after patients with atopic dermatitis hears stories about terrible sleep, sleeping for 2 to 3 hours at night, waking up several times during the night. And there's plenty of epidemiological evidence, such as shown in this Chinese study, to suggest that poor sleep is associated with cardiovascular outcomes. So that's definitely something we must consider when we're thinking about this association. What about other cardiovascular risk factors? Well, there's been lots of discussion in the dermatology literature about associations between atopic dermatitis and obesity or overweight, but the relationship appears to be complex. And what we've done is we recently looked to see if there was any association between atopic dermatitis and overweight and obesity. And this is using data from 500,000 people with atopic dermatitis in UK primary care data, matched to 1.5 million people who did not have atopic dermatitis. I'm just going to talk you through the slides. So this line is a line of no association, it's a null. And anything that crosses that suggests that there's no association. And what we see for mild eczema is that there's a very small association, an 8% increased risk. It's a little bit stronger in people with moderate eczema. But what's important here is that we're not observing a dose-response relationship. So there's no relationship that we see between severe atopic dermatitis and overweight and obesity. So that's important to consider when we're interpreting the wider literature. Of course, atopic dermatitis is associated with other health conditions such as asthma, which can be associated with cardiovascular outcomes. And there's been also lots of discussion about associations with inflammation. So we know that disorders such as rheumatoid arthritis are associated with systemic inflammation and cardiovascular diseases. But the systemic inflammation in rheumatoid arthritis is Th1, whereas here we're mainly looking at Th2 inflammation. There's a variable literature about aspects such as platelet activation and decreased clot lysis, but again, that isn't consistently seen. So if we're trying to use a study design to address the question, is there an association between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular outcomes, how could we do it? One aspect is that we could use a cross-sectional study where we look at this as a snapshot of the population, looking at both the exposure and the outcome at the same time. But there are some limitations because, of course, we can't assess the temporality, which comes first. But even more importantly, if the outcome could be fatal, for example, myocardial infarction and stroke, a cross-sectional study could be problematic because our study might only include survivors who are well enough to participate and to be included in the study. There are lots of other aspects that we as epidemiologists consider when we're looking at associations, and generally we look at evidence, the totality of the evidence from a whole range of different studies, from different epidemiological studies, from basic science, and using those in partnership. So I'm going to start off by reviewing some of the literature on the association between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular disease. And the first aspect I'll discuss is this systematic review by Jakob Thiessen and colleagues. They reviewed 7 studies, the majority of which were cross-sectional. And what I'm showing here is a summary of the adjusted estimates. And what they found is that there was absolutely no association between atopic dermatitis, looking at it as a yes-no exposure, and cardiovascular outcomes. So the diamond at the bottom, which is the summary statistic, is right on the null value, supporting no association. We wanted to look at this in a bit more detail and to consider the role of severity because of the great clinical heterogeneity in atopic dermatitis. So we did a study that included 400,000 people with atopic dermatitis, matched to 1.5 million people who did not have atopic dermatitis. And these data came from UK primary care, linked to hospitalization data and mortality data. I'm going to show you a very busy slide now, but walk through it step by step. So first of all, we looked at a range of different clinical outcomes: myocardial infarction, unstable angina, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, stroke, cardiovascular death, and coronary revascularization. We also looked at different severities of eczema: mild eczema, moderate eczema, and severe eczema. And then we did a range of different models. So our final main analysis was based on the fully adjusted model where we adjusted for confounders, but we also did a model where we adjusted for mediators, which were the factors shown in blue in the directed acyclic graph. So what did we find? Well, in the fully adjusted model, we saw a dose-response relationship between atopic dermatitis severity and all of the cardiovascular outcomes. And when we looked at the mediation model, what we can see is that although some of those associations attenuate a little bit, we're still seeing associations between atopic dermatitis and all of the cardiovascular outcomes, even after adjusting for mediators. What we did next is we repeated the systematic review, but this time we also looked at the associations by disease severity of atopic dermatitis and a range of cardiovascular outcomes. So the cardiovascular outcomes are shown in the index here: angina, cardiovascular death, heart failure, ischemic stroke, myocardial infarction, and stroke. And what we're looking at here is a summary graph looking across the different studies for the different outcomes, going from mild eczema to moderate eczema to severe eczema. And what we see here is a 15% increase in the relative risk of cardiovascular outcomes as we step up from mild to moderate and moderate to severe. It's important to say that there weren't many studies available to include in this meta-analysis, so it would be good to have more evidence here. So why are we seeing conflicting information? Well, as I showed in my first slide, atopic dermatitis is very variable in characteristics. It can be very mild or very, very severe. There are different study designs to answer this question, and it's really difficult to measure disease severity and activity, particularly in routine data. And there's variability in how patients are identified between the different studies. And of course, there's always the possibility of residual confounding. So coming back to this picture I showed at the start, when we look at eczema as a yes-no exposure, we're actually including both of these patients in our analysis. When we look by disease severity, we clearly disentangle the role of severity, which I think can be very useful in terms of interpretation. So just to summarize, I've shown you the evidence from the epidemiological studies showing evidence for an association between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular outcomes, predominantly in those with severe disease. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Sara Brown. I'm really looking forward to her talk. Thank you.
Great, thanks Sinead. So just swapping over the screen share there. So given this complexity and the challenges really of interpreting epidemiological data, how can genetic studies help? So observational epidemiology, as Sinead's shown, is very powerful, but it does have important limitations. The main limitation really is that association obviously isn't the same as causation. And also the direction of effect is very important, particularly if we want to use this as a therapeutic opportunity. So just because two diseases occur together, we need to know, is one causing the other and in which direction is it going, so we know what to target therapeutically. So how can we assess this type of causation? Well, obviously in clinical practice, a randomized controlled trial would be gold standard, but this is obviously not possible when you're looking at associations such as cardiovascular risk and atopic dermatitis. So instead we have this statistical method called Mendelian randomization, obviously named after Gregor Mendel, one of the historical greats in genetics. And if you're interested to understand the technique in more detail, some collaborators of mine have written this really nice summary of the technique with applications to dermatology as a research technique made simple in the JID. So Mendelian randomization, how can we use this for our question? Well, as I've said, it's analogous to a randomized controlled trial, but instead of using a treatment or randomization, we use genetic definition of exposure. And the exposure in this case, looking at the subset of questions from Sinead's epidemiology, is obesity. And we can use genetic definition to investigate an outcome, in this case, atopic dermatitis. And the advantages of using genetic definitions is that these are much less susceptible to the confounding that Sinead's talked about, and also less susceptible to reverse causation. So important confounders in eczema that we might all consider are things like socioeconomic status and other psychological factors, alcohol intake, the medication that we use to treat eczema, and then other confounders that we might not be aware of. And the reason that genetic definition is less susceptible to confounding is because we assume that the genetic definition of this phenotype wouldn't be the same genetic definition of these other confounding factors. And similarly with reverse causation, we know that your genetic makeup is essentially determined at conception. Therefore, by definition, it must occur first in the temporal pathway before you develop disease. So the important thing here really in applying Mendelian randomization is to be sure that you have a good knowledge of the genetic factors. So in order to define these phenotypes genetically, we need to know what are the variants that, that genetically describe and predispose strongly to these phenotypes. So coming back to the graph that Sinead showed us, that she said it isn't even as complicated as it could be, but you see there are so many mediators. It's a really complex question between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular disease. So far from a genetic perspective, we have good genetic definition of atopic dermatitis. We also have very strong genetic definition of BMI. So these are two parts of this complex graph that we can start to investigate with Mendelian randomization. And we get these genetic insights from GWAS studies. So we put together all the genetic risk from a genome-wide association study to define the phenotype. And we're interested in whether these two diseases are associated. Specifically, does obesity as a one mediator in cardiovascular disease, does that predispose to atopic dermatitis? Conversely, does atopic dermatitis predispose to obesity? And in any Mendelian randomization study, the first step is to look at, is there an observational association? So just to add to the epidemiological data that Sinead's already presented and explained is, a little bit conflicting and confusing. The data that we used for our Mendelian randomization did show a small but significant association of being overweight or obese and atopic dermatitis. Statistically significant in children, also present in adults, but you see crossing the null in both of those studies. So moving on to the assessment of causality. Firstly, what evidence is there that genetic risk for obesity predisposes to atopic dermatitis? And this was collaborative work between groups in the UK and Norway. And just to take you to the meta-analysis, the final result. So as I say, this is looking at whether there's a causal effect of obesity on, or a higher BMI, sorry, on atopic dermatitis. And here we find there is a small causal effect. So a higher BMI increases the risk of AD by about 2% for every 1 unit increase in your BMI. So a small but potentially important effect. What about the other direction? Is there evidence of a causal effect of atopic dermatitis on your BMI? And here again, using the same data, taking you to the final meta-analysed result, there is really no causal effect of AD on BMI. You can see the estimate is a very, very small change in the BMI if you have atopic dermatitis, and it overlaps the null. So really, if there is any influence of atopic dermatitis on BMI, it is so small as to be unlikely to be clinically important. So we've said that obesity seems to have a causal effect on AD. How might that be? Well, really the mechanistic pathways need further investigation, and certainly in terms of opportunities for targeting this for clinical benefit, we do need to understand the mechanisms and pathways. Sinead's already mentioned the possibility that it could be inflammation. And in this context, it's quite interesting to compare the Mendelian randomization work that we've done in atopic dermatitis with that in psoriasis. So just to reiterate what you saw on the previous slide, there's no effect of AD on a raised BMI, but there is a small effect of raised BMI on AD risk. When we compare that to psoriasis, again, there's really no substantial effect of psoriasis on your BMI, but there is actually a larger effect of BMI on psoriasis, which again is well recognized clinically. So it could be that there are common pathways in skin inflammation that are exacerbated somehow by the obese phenotype. But as I've said, the precise molecular mechanisms remain unclear. So importantly, how can we use this information to help our patients? Well, it's fair to say that AD is yet another incentive to lose weight if possible. You know, as healthcare professionals, we should take every opportunity to encourage healthy lifestyles without making people feel ashamed of their weight. But really, you know, AD is yet another incentive to lose weight if you possibly can. And conversely, our Mendelian randomization has shown that there isn't really a rationale for aggressive or very interventional treatment of AD if you're doing that with an aim to reduce BMI. Obviously, effective treatment of AD is incredibly important for the patient, but the aim is to improve the AD, and you can't say that that would have a causal effect in helping to reduce body mass index. So I'll hand now back to Sinead.
Thank you, Sarah. So I guess where are we now? Mine very nicely follows on from what Sarah just said. We should encourage adherence to standard cardiovascular prevention strategies, and that includes, for example, taking opportunities to encourage smoking cessation. What we've shown, though, is that there's epidemiological associations between severe and persistently active atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular outcomes, and that this is small but clinically important atopic dermatitis. And I think what we've shown here is the advantage of working across disciplines and triangulating evidence from different sources to try and answer this important question. But there's still a lot of work to do here. We have a lot of future work to do to understand the mechanisms and drivers of this association and what role mediators have to play. And specifically, we haven't addressed anything about what the role is about treating atopic dermatitis in relation to this outcome. It's obviously a critical question. So we have opportunities to help our patients on the population and the individual level. And I'm just going to finish off with our acknowledgement slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. This was really wonderful. And I think it really brings into light some thoughts that we are all sharing about how now to approach the connection between different diseases. We are not looking anymore at diseases individually, but we are trying to connect all of them together and try to get some insight into how to do better for our patients. So the first question, I think that atopic dermatitis is very well known, maybe even more than psoriasis, for its clinical heterogeneity. You were mentioning that before. And the question is, how does that translate into the methodology that you are using? So you are mixing together many patients with different types and subtypes of atopic dermatitis. How do you handle that from a methodological point of view?
So I guess what we've done so far is focus on the atopic dermatitis severity, dividing into mild, moderate, and severe. We've also done some limited work looking at activity of atopic dermatitis, which I think gets towards what we're talking about there. But I think what you're driving at is whether there could be specific subtypes of atopic dermatitis, which might be associated with different outcomes. And I will say that that's a very active area of interest for both Sara and myself. These are questions that we really want to answer, but I would say as yet don't have the answers to. So there is a lot of work going on this that we would hope to present to you in future.
Okay, yeah, because I think that all the topic of endotypes in atopic dermatitis is really relevant, and maybe the signal may be different when looking at different subpopulation.
Completely.
So, and then kind of follow-up question. So how do you translate this still relatively tiny risk effect into the kind of recommendations that you both were ending your lecture with? I mean, can we really, based on such a very small effect, draw such conclusions in terms of population health?
So maybe I can take that one first. So from the genetics perspective, because we've identified a small causal effect, I think that is important to share with patients. And the approach I take, if I see somebody that's overweight, there's absolutely there isn't strong enough evidence to say on an individual level, if you reduce your weight, your eczema is going to improve. But there is enough to say on a population level that the burden of atopic disease could be contributed to on a population level by the population effect of obesity. And certainly, that very small part of the complex interaction between atopic dermatitis and cardiovascular disease is something that we can target, and we need to target it for so many other reasons in the community. Atopic dermatitis is just one more reason.
I see. So we have another question here. Somebody is asking about if you could comment on the difference in magnitude of association when comparing the effect of obesity on AD versus the effect of genetically defined obesity. Sara.
Yeah, so in the Mendelian randomization study, actually the genetic effect is very similar to the observational effect. The confidence intervals vary largely because of the sample size, but actually the point estimate is very similar. So that's kind of implying that actually the association is not just an observational one, that it adds, I didn't want to overstate that, but I think it does add weight to the genetic mechanisms. But again, with the Mendelian randomization, it's important, that was very very carefully worded, Ellie, thank you. It's important to clarify that what we're looking at is a genetically defined phenotype predicting a phenotype. So it's not necessarily eczema itself directly causing, or obesity directly causing. It's genetic risk for obesity that causes the atopic dermatitis. So that's what we really need to, drill down on and understand what facets of obesity, what mechanisms, what pathways are driving the skin inflammation, because then we can target them therapeutically, and we might be able to target them. So rather than just telling the patients to lose weight, which we all know is incredibly difficult, if we can tease out the pathways, we might be able to treat the pathways rather than just simply the obesity. Thank you.
And there is another question for Sinead about, so somebody's asking here about the possibility that there may be differences in association of AD and cardiovascular disease between chronic or childhood onset and adulthood onset. So did you observe such differences?
Yeah, it's a very good question, isn't it? Because I guess what it drives to is whether you've had this disease your entire life. And it kind of comes back to the subtype question, doesn't it? I don't think we can particularly answer that in our data though, because the median duration of follow-up in our data sources is approximately 5 years. So while we do take approaches to try and tease out whether the atopic dermatitis is prevalent or incident, it's not possible to say that with a substantial degree of confidence. But it's a good question. And I think it comes back to the subtypes question that we're all trying to answer.
So do we have, we are really coming to the end, but just a last question for Sara. How important is it to account for epigenetic changes which could potentially act as confounding factors in Mendelian randomization studies?
So that's a very big question. I guess the point about—
I'll try to answer it shortly.
The point about epigenetic changes is that you can still detect them in GWAS. So the majority of the GWAS variants are intergenic, so they're likely to be representing non-exonic mechanisms which contribute hugely to epigenetic mechanisms. So I guess the ideal would be to do an EWAS, which we as so far don't have sufficiently powered in atopic dermatitis, but don't underplay the fact that we detect very strong epigenetic effects from GWAS variants. So I don't think that's something that we're overlooking.
So thank you very, very much. I'd like to thank you both for a particularly fascinating discussion today. And I'd like also to invite everybody for the next recipe book episode of The Kitchen on epigenomic profiling by Andrew G, due January 27. Thank you all for having been with us today. Stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.